The Denver Broncos are surprising everyone because after 2 mediocre years with Russell Wilson, the team has seemingly gotten back on track. They're currently 8-5, and Bo Nix is currently either the favorite or in the running for the Offensive Rookie of the Year award. So in today's video, I want to discuss the sudden rise of the Denver Broncos and what they could do in the future to continue their ascent. But if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, of course, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button because that would help me out a ton. Let's hop into it. So the way we're going to talk about this video is we're just going to begin by talking about what this team has been doing thus far through the season, and then eventually we'll start talking about what they can do in free agency and in the draft to, of course, improve their odds of potentially winning a championship with Bo Nix. I think the best way to start this video is just by going over a couple of general statistics because I do think that sets a pretty solid groundwork of what we're going to talk about in this video. Offensively speaking, this team has taken a really sizable step forward. They currently rank 13th in points per game, 21st in yards per game, and 14th in touchdowns per game. This is a team that doesn't have a bunch of really good weapons. Their running back is not very particularly good, and the receiving core outside of Courtland Sutton is for the most part pretty weak. So the fact that this offense is taking steps forward, despite the fact they didn't really upgrade the offense that much from last year, is pretty impressive. On the defensive side of things, though, it looks really good. On defense, they only give up 18.0 points per game, which ranks them number 3 in the NFL. They're only giving up 315.7 yards per game, which puts them number 9 in the NFL. And they're only giving up 1.8 touchdowns per game, which puts them at number 3 in the NFL. Now, if you actually watched what happened yesterday, where the Cleveland Browns dropped, I think, like over 30 points on them, and Jameis Winston went for about 500 yards, then that wasn't the greatest showcase of what this Denver Broncos defense has been all year, but for the most part, this Denver defense has been straight up awesome. When you look at their record, again, they're 8-5, they're riding a 3-game win streak. I wouldn't say, though, that they're a fantastic 8-5 team. Let me kind of explain myself. When I think of a team that's 8-5, I generally think of a really good team that's gone up against a couple really good opponents and has also lost a couple games, sort of like, you know, the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens have some very impressive wins while also having a couple bad losses. Whereas for this Broncos team, they really only have like 2 wins that I think are truly impressive. Because if you look at their wins, their best 2 games in which they went up against good competition and won was against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in week 3, where they just beat up on Baker Mayfield and a healthy Buccaneers team 26-7. And I would also say their next most impressive win was that Atlanta Falcons game in week 11, where they beat up on Kirk Cousins and the Falcons. Outside of those 2 games, their wins are against the New York Jets, who are not a very good team, the Raiders twice, the Carolina Panthers, the New Orleans Saints without Derek Carr, and most recently, Cleveland Browns. Again, I don't want to diminish what they've done. This is definitely an awesome turnaround, especially for a team that last year missed the playoffs and now is looking like a team that should make the playoffs. It's an impressive turnaround regardless of who they are actually beating. I just wanted to kind of clarify that there are better 8-5 teams out there than this Broncos team. Hopefully you guys get what I'm kind of saying here. Let's go ahead and kind of just go through the depth chart. We'll start off with the offense. I have been extremely impressed with Bo Nix. On the year, Bo Nix has 2,842 passing yards, 17 touchdowns, and 8 interceptions. And these past couple weeks have been some of maybe his better weeks of the season. To start the year off, he was a little bit slow. I had a couple picks early on, but most recently, he's put together a lot of really good games. And even though last week against the Browns, he had a couple interceptions, I thought he played pretty damn good in that game as well. Since those first couple early games where he was basically a check down monster, he's really turned into a quarterback that is really good and actually capable of leading a team to victory. Again, despite not necessarily having the greatest talent around him. It also does feel like his pairing with him and Sean Payton is perfect, and honestly, it kind of is exactly what we thought it could be coming out of the draft. I would be lying to you guys if I said that I thought Bo Nix was a great draft pick for the Denver Broncos. I wasn't necessarily against it, but I felt like it was maybe a tad bit of a reach to draft him in the top 15 of the first round. But after seeing him through the first 13 weeks of the season, I can honestly tell you guys that I think he's lived up to that draft pick, and I guess I was wrong. Sometimes it doesn't matter how talented you are or how bad you were in college or how good you were in college. It just kind of matters what team you go on and what team gives you an opportunity. And I think that's kind of a good example for Bo Nix. Bo Nix was a great college quarterback. He was great for Auburn for a couple years, great for Oregon, obviously. But of course, being an older guy at 24 years old, heading into the first round, not a lot of expectations were on him. But you pair him with, Sean Payton, who's an offensive genius, and you put him in a system that's kind of quarterback friendly, of course he was going to succeed. And honestly, I think a lot of us were blind to it. Again, I think he's playing at a borderline offensive rookie of the year level. I would probably still give the award to Jaden Daniels because he is playing at, in my opinion, just a tad bit of a higher level. And I also do think his highs are a little bit higher than a guy like Bo Nix. But at the same time, I think Bo Nix has been better these past 4 or 5 weeks more so than Jaden Daniels, so I do think that he has closed the gap significantly. Again, as I said in the introduction, I would say he's either the favorite to win it or probably the second favorite to win it. I know Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey are having some great years, but let's be honest, they're not giving it to a non-quarterback. They're going to give it to either Jaden Daniels or Bo Nix, barring some sort of disastrous conclusion to their seasons. So yeah, let's just shut that down. I love Brock Bowers. He's probably not going to win the award. I also do think that we have to have a bit of a conversation about Sean Payton being in the conversation for Coach of the Year. I don't think I would give it to him because I think there's other guys out there like Mike Tomlin and Dan Campbell who do deserve it a bit more than Sean Payton. But again, Sean Payton last year missed the playoffs and has this team rolling, going 8-5. A lot of us, not necessarily myself, but a lot of people in the media had this Broncos team being a team that didn't even win 7 games this year. But obviously they've already passed 7 wins. They're at 8 wins through 13 weeks, and they're more than likely going to make the playoffs. So given our expectations for this team, I think you have to at least put the conversation out there that Sean Payton should be in the conversation. Again, I wouldn't personally give it to him, but you know, you never know. So when you look at the pros of this team, I think this team has a really solid young quarterback who's going to be on a rookie deal for the next 3 or 4 years. Obviously, you kind of have to go all in on a young quarterback with a cheap contract. That's kind of how the NFL works. I also think this defense is just straight up awesome. Does it have some weaknesses? Of course, every team has a, unit that isn't the greatest, but I feel like this defense is maybe the best or second best unit in the entire NFL. Their pass rush is ridiculous. They have so many different options who can actually get to the quarterback, whether that is a Jonathan Cooper or Nick Bonito or Zach Allen. They just got so many different guys who can actually get the job done. I think their linebackers are okay. I wouldn't say they're the greatest. Cody Barton is a good player, and they got some other guys there too. Maybe a potential upgrade spot in the offseason, but I'm not necessarily making that a priority. The cornerbacks, obviously Patrick Surtain is maybe the best cornerback in the league. Riley Moss has also shown a couple glimpses of potentially being a really good cornerback. I will say if you can find an upgrade over him for the cheaps, I would potentially look at upgrading over him. But outside of that, I think this defense is just really good and really set for the future as long as you bring everyone back. The nice thing about this team, they have plenty of assets, about $57 million in cap space in 2025 to go along with most of their draft picks. But of course, like every team, there are certain weaknesses with this roster. As I mentioned a tad bit earlier, this team is just really lacking in offensive weapons. Right now, their running back room is kind of a running back by committee. You have Audric Estime, Javonte Williams, and Jaleel McLaughlin. None of those guys, in my opinion, are all that impressive. I know that Audric Estime is young and has some talent, and he's kind of a bulldozery type of guy, but I wasn't very high on him coming out of college, and I'm just still not very high on him right now. If I was to use Audric Estime, it would be just kind of a goal line back, a 3rd and short, a 4th and inches type of guy. I don't think I would typically use him in just a regular running play. Javonte and Jaleel both have talents, but again, I don't necessarily think that they're game changers. I don't think they're dynamic enough to really consider keeping them as the starters long term. So whether it's this offseason or in a future offseason, I do think that is a position that I would definitely be looking to upgrade. And then for the wide receiver position, it's kind of the same thing. There isn't necessarily a great group of guys. I will say there's one really good player. Courtland Sutton is obviously a really solid wide receiver. I think the interesting thing about Courtland Sutton is that I don't necessarily view him as a true wide receiver 1, but he might very well be a good enough, capable wide receiver 1. I kind of view him as a high-level wide receiver 2 that can occasionally be a true wide receiver 1 if need be, and for now, he is the wide receiver 1, but ideally, I would like to see him be more of a wide receiver 2. But outside of Sutton, it's pretty void of not necessarily talent, but just capable starters. You have guys like Troy Franklin who have made a couple splash plays, Marvin Mims who's also made a couple plays throughout his career but isn't necessarily a full-time starter. Lil Jordan Humphrey occasionally will make a nice play but again shouldn't be a true starting wide receiver in the NFL. And then Devon Valet is a good player who's made a couple nice plays but kind of a theme of what I've been talking about, probably not a future starter on this team moving forward, maybe a 4th or 5th or even 3rd maybe at best. So for this team moving forward, getting a true wide receiver alongside Courtland Sutton is going to be a major focal point of the offseason. I think another con for this team moving forward is that they're in a division that is going to be improving. Right now, the division is kind of a division that is all kind of improving outside of the Raiders. The Chargers took a big step forward from last year to this year. The Chiefs are still one of the best teams, if not the best team in the NFL. And the Las Vegas Raiders are likely going to add a quarterback in the offseason, so we can make a pretty fair and honest assumption that they're going to be a better team next year than this year. Hey guys, I just want to interrupt real real quickly, I did just start a brand new YouTube channel called Metro Stories. It is a channel simply focused on NFL team stories as well as NFL player stories. If that sort of stuff does interest you, go ahead and check the pinned comment down below as well as in the description where you will find a link to my new channel. But let's get back into the video. So when you look at that, you're looking at a situation where Denver is improving while everyone else is also improving. So it just kind of depends on how much you're actually taking the necessary steps to be even that much better to get better in your division. I still think the Chiefs are clearly the best team in the division, but a team like the LA Chargers and Denver Broncos are going to be fighting for those spots, so it's going to be some very fun battles moving forward. Now, when we look towards the future, I'm just going to kind of make this very quick because I don't want to give specific names and specific players who I think this team should target, but I'll give you guys just a couple general ideas. Again, as I mentioned, they do have plenty of assets to hand out. They have around $57 million in cap space to go along with multiple draft picks. With that said, though, they do have a couple free agents on their current roster that I do think they do need to bring back. For starters, I think Garrett Bowles needs to be brought back. He is a little bit older and maybe not the greatest offensive tackle in the world, but he is a very capable and honestly a very good starting offensive tackle in this league. So if he does require $15 to $20 million, I would be willing to give him some. I also do think DJ Jones should also be somewhat of a priority to bring back. Now, I will say I'm not necessarily making him my #1 priority because there was already a couple rumors that he might be traded in the trade deadline. But I do think he's a really solid run stuffer that does give you a couple things in terms of pass rushing, but it's just primarily a really solid run stuffer. There's a couple of different names as well, like Riley Dixon, your punter, and Justin Strnad, one of your linebackers. I think those guys are fairly cheap options that I would bring back on smaller deals that could be, just good holders of those positions for the next couple years. And in terms of free agency, I don't necessarily think this team should be all that aggressive. Sure, if you can go out there and sign a big name running back or a big name wide receiver, I definitely do think you could do so. For example, if a guy like Najee Harris wants to leave Pittsburgh, which I don't think he will, but if he wants to leave, I do think Denver would be a nice spot for him. If you are looking for more of a running back 2 or just sort of another body in that running back room to pair alongside a rookie guy, somebody like Nick Chubb or AJ Dillon would be good fits as well. I will say there's a couple of linebacker prospects in free agency that I think could be good fits, especially if you want to look for more of an inside linebacker type of guy. Guys like Dre Greenlaw, Kazir White, Isaiah Simmons are all good names that I do think this team could definitely look at if they want to find an upgrade in that position. Obviously, Dre Greenlaw is probably the only big time upgrade within these guys I just mentioned. And again, for wide receiver, there are guys out there like Keenan Allen and Stephon Diggs who could pair pretty nicely alongside a guy like Courtland Sutton, but those guys are going to want pretty sizable deals, and I just don't know if you should really hand out massive contracts, especially when this is a growing team that's still young. I think you can get a lot of your draft picks to play right away and be, honestly, just as good and cheaper than some of these guys in free agency. So in terms of your draft picks, I'm only going to talk about the first 3 rounds, and I'm not necessarily going to give you guys specific names, but I'll just give you guys positions and maybe some guys to look at. In the first round, I do think it has to be an offensive weapon, whether that is an Ashton Jeanty for running back or a tight end like a James Warren from Penn State or a Colson Loveland from Michigan, who I've pretty consistently mocked to this Denver team in my mock drafts. Or if a wide receiver were to fall like a Tetairoa McMillan, Luther Burden, or maybe an Isaiah Bond, who I think would pair nicely alongside a Courtland Sutton, maybe you could target one of those guys. Those same position groups would also apply for the second round. If you don't take a tight end in the first round, maybe you would take one in the second round. Same thing with wide receiver or offensive lineman or anything like that. Again, if you don't necessarily want to address the cornerback room in free agency, you could potentially add a second cornerback in the draft in the second or even the third round. I think an interesting name, depending on what his injury is going to look like, because I believe he has a hip injury, could be Benjamin Morrison. He's a first round talent that does have a hip injury, I do believe. So that's a pretty big injury, but if he does turn out to be okay, but his draft stock does fall because of it, maybe you'd be willing to wait a year for him to, get healthy and then play him in 2026 or 7. And then in the third round, I think either targeting an interior offensive lineman or a running back would definitely be a solid group to look at in the third round. Again, I think the first and second round, you really have to look at either tight end or wide receiver to add pieces into that room to make your offense better. But if the draft board doesn't fall your way, maybe you could potentially look for a couple other position groups such as a linebacker or a cornerback. And then again, the third round, I think you got to focus on adding a running back because this is a pretty solid and deep running back class. So you could find a really good running back in the third round, as well as potentially an interior offensive lineman, because even though your interior isn't bad, it definitely could be better. And maybe you want to add more depth in that position group. But outside of that, I don't really feel like this team has to be terribly aggressive in making big time splash trades or making big time free agency moves. This is a really good team that only has a couple of just minor holes they really have to look to address. But that's basically everything I need to say about this Broncos team. They're a young developing team that, in my opinion, is only a few pieces away from truly taking that big next step, if we suppose that Bo Nix also takes a big next step. I like this team. I hope they succeed moving forward. But if you guys did enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button. And I love you guys. Peace.